This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Lokui Su. Tonight's top stories. Saudi Arabia's offer of crude checks a surge in oil prices, but Asia gripped by inflation concerns on supplies disrupted amid war in the Middle East. Iran marks with more strikes the appointment of a new supreme leader, the son of the Ayatollah, assassinated late February. The US and Israel warned Mojtaba Khamenei is next on their kill list. For 13 years of a corruption crackdown under Xi Jinping as head of China's Communist Party, the Chief Justice of the Supreme People's Court pressing on with a 20% jump last year on duty-related cases. On the Chinese bid for self-sufficiency shaping how it gets its weapons, a Swedish think tank reports steep falls in imports with a decisive swing to production at home. Ahead on the bulletin, CNA has doubled its global footprint over the last 2 years, reaching more than 180 million homes and connected devices. We'll show you how it marked that milestone. The war in Iran has disrupted commercial shipping in the Gulf, a vital source of fuel and petroleum products. Oil prices breaking through the psychological threshold of $100 per barrel. If sustained, higher prices will drive up inflation, hit household spending, and hurt economies across the world. Roland Lim joins us to discuss the impact on Asian economies, which rely heavily on Middle Eastern crude.
Thanks, Wei Su. Yeah, if the Strait of Hormuz is the world's energy choke point, well, Asia is where the pressure lands first. Around 4/5 of crude and LNG moving through Hormuz usually heads to Asian buyers. China, India, Japan, and South Korea are the key destinations. Now, Japan and South Korea are the most exposed. Japan gets around 75% of its oil and about 10 to 15% of its LNG via Hormuz. And South Korea buys around 60% of its oil and 50 to 20% of its LNG from the Middle East, leaving both highly vulnerable. Now, in rough total energy terms, that's about a quarter of each country's energy system. India looks somewhat less exposed in percentage terms. About 50% of India's crude imports pass through Hormuz. Now, China is the least vulnerable of the four relative to its sheer size. Now, China gets about half of its oil imports from the Middle East. Beijing also has more fallback options than its neighbors. Russian and Central Asian gas pipelines, rising domestic production, coal, and the ability to cut spot LNG buying. The buffers for each country, meanwhile, look uneven. Now, Japan has the biggest formal oil cushion, about 254 days of consumption, including national and private stocks. And South Korea says its combined stockpile covers around 208 days. Now, China's reserves are more opaque, although Reuters cites broader analyst estimates of around 900 million barrels, which works out to be about 3.5 months of imports. India's official strategic petroleum reserves alone just 9.5 days, although total crude and product storage is much larger at around 74 days. And the hard truth is, alternatives to fossil fuel are still limited. Now, oil and gas remains the mainstay energy source powering the global economy, despite the recent pivot to renewables and green energy sources that have yet to make an impact. So, for Asia, the first line of defense is stockpiles. The second, rerouting, and then rationing. There's no full substitute if the Strait of Hormuz stays shut for long. And analysts compare the current oil supply disruptions to one from the Ukraine war and the Arab oil embargo back in the 70s.
It portends one of the biggest disruptions to oil and gas markets that has been seen, potentially even larger in scope than the Ukraine war in 2022 when Russia turned off its gas to Europe. And we haven't seen any spikes really of this magnitude until going back as far as the 1970s. Even then, if you look at the scope of the passage and the importance of the passage of the Strait of Hormuz, a continued disruption to flows here would portend 3 times the impact to oil and gas markets that we saw during the oil shocks in the 1970s.
And I'll tell you more about the knock-on effects in the equity markets today with steep losses in both Japan and South Korea. But now, it's over to you, Wei Su.
Oh, thanks for that, Roland. Iran ramping up its offensive against Israel after declaring who it has appointed as its next supreme leader. Mojtaba Khamenei will succeed his father, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed in U.S.-Israeli strikes more than a week ago. Since his appointment, Israel's military says it has identified a new wave of missiles coming from Iran. The IDF also launching strikes in central Iran and targeting military infrastructure belonging to Iranian proxies Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran's Assembly of Experts has called for unity as top officials pledge allegiance to Mojtaba Khamenei. The succession marks the first father-to-son transfer of power in the history of the Islamic Republic. The U.S. president has called the younger Khamenei an unacceptable choice. China says Iran's decision is an internal issue and has opposed any attempt to target the new leader. Neighbouring Qatar, the UAE and Kuwait are on high alert as Iran intensifies its offensive across the Gulf. Tehran's latest attack on the El Mamea oil facility in Bahrain has prompted state-owned energy firm Babco to declare force majeure, signalling it will not be able to fulfill its oil deliveries. 32 people were injured in a separate strike in the same area. Saudi Arabia is renewing its calls for de-escalation. The foreign ministry slamming Tehran's attacks as reprehensible after thwarting drone attacks on its massive Sheba oil field. A key oil transport route, the Strait of Hormuz, is still at a virtual standstill, squeezing energy supplies to Asia and pushing up prices. South Korea says it will cap fuel prices for the first time in nearly 30 years and look for alternative sources of energy. Japan sharing that concern, but Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has ruled out overhauling her big spending budget, saying the government could tap on its reserves. A flight chartered by Japan is set to leave Saudi Arabia today for citizens who wish to go home. Its foreign ministry has been evacuating hundreds of its nationals from the Gulf states by land to either Riyadh or Muscat. Last night, a government-chartered plane landed in Tokyo carrying more than 100 Japanese from Oman. Much of the airspace in the region is still closed over missile and drone concerns. Since the start of the conflict, more than 37,000 flights to and from the Middle East have had to be cancelled, stranding tens of thousands of travellers.
泊まっていたホテルに、ミサイルのデブリが落ちました。帰る予定がずっと帰れなくて、で飛行機会社をどんどん変えるというか時間を変えたりしたんですけど、キャンセルで。
Japan's Self-Defense Forces airplane has also arrived in the Maldives to assist in the evacuation. Japan says the number of people hoping to evacuate is larger than expected, so more flights have had to be prepared. China's weapons imports diving even as the global arms trade grew almost 10% over the last 5 years. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute releasing figures showing Chinese imports from 2021 to 2025 dropping 72% from 2016 to 2020, with one reason being a marked shift to domestic manufacture. China is the world's fifth largest supplier of arms, accounting for more than 5% of global exports from 2021 to 2025. Chinese exports going up 11% in the same period, with nearly 80% of that volume going to Asia and Oceania and 13% going to Africa. Pakistan, at 61% of total exports, is its biggest buyer. Elsewhere in East Asia, Japan and Taiwan saw large increases in arms imports at 76% and 54% between 2016 to 2020 and 2021 to 2025, largely on concerns over Beijing's intentions and capabilities. More than 13 years with China's President Xi Jinping as Communist Party chief, and his crackdown on corruption is not easing on any front. China planning a law that will target offences across borders. The Standing Committee of China's top legislature delivering its work report today at the two sessions in Beijing. The Supreme Court pointing to 36,000 cases last year involving duty-related crimes, such as corruption and bribery. That's up by more than 20% from the year before, involving more than 40,000 people. Xi Jinping seen the rooting out of corruption as a signature campaign since taking office as party chief in 2012. The sweep extending into the highest levels of the Chinese military. Efforts also focused on hunting down officials who have fled the country. More than $2.6 billion in illicit gains were seized last year.
干警违纪违法问题仍有发生，我们将突出问题导向，努力解决。
Former senior banker Bai Tianhui was executed last year after taking more than $155 billion in bribes. In a case which Chinese officials say damaged interests of the state and the people. Former agricultural minister Tang Renjian was also named. He was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve last year for accepting more than $37 million in bribes. Lawmakers also announcing plans for laws on financial stability and childcare services, while stepping up research to advance legislation on artificial intelligence. I'll have much more in China's 2 sessions ahead on this bulletin. Sunday seeing top diplomat Wang Yi laying out Beijing's foreign policy stance. We have more from our correspondents and Associate Professor Dylan Low from Nanyang Technological University. And still on East Asia tonight, with crude prices spiking on the Middle East war and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz stalled. We speak to an oil expert on where prices might be going from here.
The global care conundrum, as nurses from Asia seek better opportunities overseas.
Helping their family means they have to leave the country.
They leave gaps in healthcare systems at home, even as host countries tighten migration rules.
We cannot accept applications from overseas.
Nurses Beyond Borders, Wednesday on CNA.
吐露港公路由九龍入嚟，第一個見到個屋苑就係雲福苑，就係個地標就知道哦，到咗大埔啦。我媽咪 WhatsApp 我同我嗰個話火燭，但我喺的士上面又再嘗試打俾佢啦，咁其實佢已經冇再聽電話。
我哋一啲叫做災難後嘅反應、創傷後遺症咧，係可以 last 好耐。
如果死者係冇遺體嘅話咧，其實佢係 ambiguous loss。complicated grief。
一嚟到就係有張床，跟住就係咩都冇嘅。即係呢個生活唔係我自己想父母嘅生活嚟嘅，咁我會覺得如果一日未有一個安置嘅計劃啊，我都覺得係未寫到。
The way we build is changing.
I do feel like I'm playing a game and the final boss is a good building design.
We need to come up with ways to deal with scarce resources.
But for decades, productivity has remained largely unchanged.
Can the industry truly work differently?
Any technology that can help us improve is exciting for us.
Building Change, Thursday on CNA.
Brought to you by Build SG, championed by BCA.
And welcome back to East Asia tonight. And Roland Lim joins us with more business news. And we start, of course, with the price of oil.
Yes, that's right. Now, analysts are saying the oil surge could actually last longer, more than $100. And if the Strait of Hormuz closes for longer, the rest of this month, Goldman Sachs predicts that oil could hit its peak in 2022 of $139 and potentially challenge all-time record of $147 back in 2008. Asian markets plunging on the prospects of global economy taking a blow. This as the Middle East crisis continues into a second week with no sign of letting up. With the Strait of Hormuz, which carries a fifth of the world's oil, now impassable, Well, Iraq's output has fallen to 1.7 to 1.8 million barrels a day, down from the 4.3 before the conflict. Mounting threats to oil infrastructure also raising the risk of prolonged disruptions. Import-dependent Asia, heavily reliant on Middle East crude, is feeling the sharpest impact. A steep sell-off in equity markets in Japan, South Korea and Taiwan. Nikkei index closed down more than 5% and South Korea's Kospi by 6%. Similar picture on the mainland and India, but these markets pared some of those losses on a Financial Times report saying that finance ministers from the group of 7 nations would discuss tapping emergency reserves in coordination with the International Energy Agency. Asian airlines bearing the brunt of surging oil prices and related inflation shocks, carriers across the region ending Monday's session deep in the red as the war in Iran continues to disrupt travel. Disruptions to crude supply are boosting demand for crop-based biofuels, lifting vegetable oils and corn. Now, palm oil posted its biggest jump since 2022, while Chicago soybean oil futures rose up 5%. Now, wheat gained more than 3%, corn climbing more than 2%. And soybeans also advancing. Analysts warn inflationary pressures will intensify if the conflict drags on. Now, for more insights on the continuing conflict, we are joined by Taimur Baig, who is chief economist at DBS Bank. Taimur, good to have you on the show. Now, based on how oil and equity markets reacted today, are we moving into something more dangerous and more persistent for the global economy?
I'm afraid so. I think the premise in the run-up to this war, which was a fairly well-telegraphed war, but the premise was it will be short-lived and it would leave the Straits of Hormuz open. I think the markets and general observers around the world are all taken aback by the ferocity of the attack that Iran has endured over the last 8-9 days and the frequency with which it is retaliating. And we are heading into a very dangerous area where instead of military targets being the primary source of conflagration, civilian targets or energy infrastructure, all of those things seem to be on the cards on both sides. We have seen stories related to desalination plant to oil depots being hit, and we have heard messages from the Iranians that they will not allow most ships to go through the Straits of Hormuz. So this is, I would argue, is a higher level of anxiety for the market than it was prepared to embrace even a week ago.
So this suggests that $110 today, that's just a pit stop, that it could go to 120 or even higher.
Okay, I would like to put that in perspective. Yes, on a month-on-month basis, it is a very dramatic shift in market pricing. A month ago, we were looking at $60, $70 oil. Relative to that, this is shocking. But the world can take some degree of energy pain without capitulating into a recession or outright collapse. We are not in any sort of position like that. We're talking about one choke point in the world. There is plenty of energy, particularly with respect to crude oil around the world. LNG might be a tougher case because Qatar is a very large source of LNG, especially for our part of the world. But if we are going to talk about oil in real terms, adjusted for inflation, oil today, even at $115, is about 45% below its all-time peak. That was in 2008. So we don't think that we are heading into a situation like a worldwide stagflationary risk, prolonged economic slump, none of that. Premised around that, 2 issues. One, these price levels are levels that the world economy can absorb, not happily, but it can absorb. Our energy intensity has declined over the last few decades, and there are plenty of alternative sources of energy. Secondly, I still think, or rather, I still hope that this would be a short-lived conflagration, and a month from now, month and a half from now, some of this stuff would be a distant memory.
Taimur, you've studied past oil shocks very closely. How does this one compare to the earlier crises, say for the invasion of Ukraine as well as in the 70s?
I suppose one area what does give me pause is the Straits of Hormuz has really never been closed. Even during the Iran-Iraq war of the 80s, or when Saddam's troops were withdrawing from Kuwait and setting oil fields on fire, even in times like that, we never had the Straits of Hormuz closing. The fact that only a few ships are going through and things could go worse, that is certainly worrying, and it doesn't really have a precedent. So in that aspect, the historical context does make this particular situation rather ominous than anything that we've seen before. But we should also consider the other side, which is something that I just alluded to, is that from a global supply perspective, alternative to fossil fuel perspective, we're in a sounder position today than we've ever been. So, of course, we will take cognizance of the shock and revise down GDP forecast, revise up inflation forecast, worry about currencies in certain countries in the world where the balance of payments might come under pressure. All of those things are being worked out in real time, and none of those things paint a happy picture. But at the same time, we should take the cognizance of the fact that in real terms, oil is much lower in historical terms, and in terms of supply of energy, we do have quite a few other things going around right now. We're not that vulnerable.
Taimur, appreciate your insights, and we will, of course, be covering this very closely. That was Taimur Baig, Chief Economist at DBS Bank. And that's your business news for now. Back to you, Wei Su.
Thank you, Roland. CNA has doubled its footprint over the past 2 years and is now available to more than 180 million homes and connected devices globally. Driving the expansion since 2024 is CNA Originals, as a documentary-centric, free ad-supported TV channel designed to better serve audiences in the Western Hemisphere. CNA marked its latest milestone with 2 special events over the weekend in the German capital, Berlin. Ross Cullen takes us there.
An afternoon in Germany with a Singaporean twist. Diplomats, business people and other invited guests networked and enjoyed excerpts of news bulletins and documentaries, marking the expanding international presence of CNA Originals, an offering tailor-made for audiences in the Western Hemisphere. It's available on streaming services in North America and Europe, including Rakuten TV, Whale TV Plus and Vida in Germany.
To understand Asia requires more than just data points. It requires depth, context, analysis, nuance, and cultural fluency. And that is the strength of CNA in Asia.
Germany is now among the media service's top 10 markets for YouTube viewers. CNA has had 500 million views on the platform in the last 12 months alone. In February, Singapore and Germany launched a bilateral Year of Innovation that builds on an earlier strategic partnership, underscoring the importance of the EU's largest economy for the Southeast Asian nation.
I think in recent years there's been a growing interest here in Europe to better understand Asia. And so I think we're all very pleased to see CNA Originals expanding further to Europe. And I think today the world is full of information. But what the audience wants is not just information, but they want information that is up to date, reliable, and high quality. And I think this is where CNA Originals can fill the gap.
The aim is to help a global audience understand Asia at a time of geopolitical upheaval, with war in the Middle East, continuing conflict in Ukraine, and worldwide economic policy shocks.
It's so important what CNA is doing exactly at this moment in time. In a time of geopolitical tensions, it's more important than ever to get a diverse perspective on the world.
Not only do we understand it, we speak the language of the countries that we're at.
Familiar faces introduced the channel's flagship news programs and acclaimed documentaries, including East Asia Tonight and Insight.
Right now, at this day and age, news is vitally important, especially news coming from a reliable source, which is what we've got here. And also very important is we need different focuses from different parts of the world.
The Berlin audience learned more about CNA's wider programming, investigating themes like AI, nuclear energy, and art and architecture.
We should not be left behind, especially in Asia. And now that the world and Europe-wide, they have seen the capacity of what Asians could do in terms of IT, AI, and robotics, they should be aware of who we are in terms of technology.
I really get a lot of questions from Asia. How can we come to the German market or come to Berlin? And I know that a lot of people who are interested in architecture travel to Asia because of the history of architecture.
CNA's growing global presence in Europe was not only celebrated with ambassadors and business people, this second event opened up awareness of the channel to a wider German audience.
At the outreach session in the Mall of Berlin, there was fan painting, a photo booth station and popcorn to be had during a screening of CNA's documentaries, as the multi-platform service continues to build its audience far beyond Asia. For CNA, I'm Ross Cullen in Berlin.
Still ahead on East Asia tonight, the latest reactions to China's foreign policy stance on the war in Iran, its ties with the US, and more. What's at stake for Beijing? We get insights from an expert.
Saturday on Japan Hour. Cycling around Fuji and the Highlands in the winter.
Yeah.
Our cyclists discover how life can be challenging. But you will be rewarded with majestic views.
Incredible.
And delicious meals. Japan Hour, Saturday on CNA.
Japan Hour is brought to you by Sumitomo Corporation. MUFG, committed to empowering a brighter future. Zip Air, no fuel surcharge from 216 Singapore dollars. And IHI.
This is East Asia tonight, and these are the headlines. The surge in energy prices sparks market turmoil and moves by governments in Asia to insulate economies from the effects of higher inflation as the war in the Middle East widens. Iran marked with more strikes, the appointment of a new supreme leader, the son of the Ayatollah, assassinated late February. The US and Israel warn Mojtaba Khamenei is next on their kill list, with China opposing any attempt to target this new leader. And no let-up in China's crackdown on corruption. The Chief Justice of the Supreme People's Court pressing on with a 20% jump last year on duty-related cases. Our top diplomat Wang Yi setting out where Beijing stands on a wide range of issues in foreign policy. He condemned the war in the Middle East, saying it benefits no one and, quote, should never have happened. But despite differences with the US on Iran and trade tariffs, China is eyeing a landmark year for ties with Washington, with President Donald Trump expected to visit Beijing later this month. Wang Yi had strong words for Japan, though, saying relations would depend on choices made by Tokyo. Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi has yet to take back a comment she made in Parliament in November that Japan could intervene if China should attack Taiwan. And we're joined by CNA correspondent Deborah Wong and Associate Professor Dylan Low from the Public Policy and Global Affairs Program at Nanyang Technological University. Thanks for joining us this evening, Dr. Low. Let's start with you first, Deborah. Wang Yi, tough job. This address both to reassure and also assert, speaking both to domestic and international audiences. How would you describe his tone?
So there were 21 questions that Foreign Minister Wang Yi took, wide-ranging questions. We had questions from China's relationship with the U.S. down to neighborhood diplomacy in South Asia, as well as the Taiwan Strait. I'm going to take you through the tone for some of the key questions that he raised, that he answered. There was a constant theme in the presser. We know that China's foreign policy hinges on open dialogue and cooperation, conversations as well. And Wang Yi made that quite clear as he answered all these questions. For the U.S., Wang Yi says that the bilateral relationship is right now back to an even keel after a year of ups and downs. But he still rejected the idea and the proposal from the U.S. on co-governance because he says that China believes in a multipolar world. And on the dispute with Japan, that also took center stage because that has been playing out, the tensions have been playing out in the last couple of months. And Mr. Wang says that the future of Sino-Japan relations hinges on Japan's choices right now. And it really is a reference to Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's remarks over Taiwan. She had refused to retract those remarks, and China had pressed her to do so. Now, on to the self-ruled island, Taiwan, Wang Yi once again saying that it's a red line for China. He once again says that the DPP chief, William Lai, who's also the president of Taiwan, undermined stability in the strait. But he reserved the strongest words for the crisis brewing in the Middle East right now. He says that it's a war that should not have happened and that the sovereignty of states should be respected. On that front, he also did position China as a peacekeeping force and as a friend of the Middle East. Let's hear a recap.
作为中东国家的真正朋友和战略伙伴，中方我们愿意同中东国家一起践行全球安全倡议，还中东以秩序，还人民以安宁，还世界以和平。
Oh, Dylan, let's bring you in here. We heard Wang Yi there. Criticism of the United States not pointed, just refers to it as major power, so an indirect reference there. Mr. Wang essentially concentrating his eye on Japan. How would you read this?
Yep, I think it's quite clear when you contrast the response of Wang Yi with regards to the military strikes and its response to Japan. With Japan, it was very clearly reiterated again that Taiwan was the raiders of red lines. It not only signals to Japan, but I think it signals to other countries as well that there is a cost for intervening or for speaking out in the Taiwan issue. I think more importantly, it showed me that Beijing is not ready to de-escalate. I think there is very little room for compromise in what he said. And this is contrasted with regards to the US strikes on the Middle East. Because if you look at the response to the Middle East, there was no direct criticism of the US. There was no direct criticism of Trump. In fact, I would go to say that its response is relatively mild even. I think it's because the priority of the C-Trump summit is far more important at this moment than any attempt to directly call out US.
But China does have stakes in what happens in the Middle East, certainly the Strait of Hormuz. It does rely to some extent for its oil imports from not just Iran, but the wider Middle East, so Kuwait, the UAE, as well as Saudi Arabia. It has interest in making sure trade routes, energy supply routes remain open. At what point would it actually feel it needs to respond?
Absolutely. It has a lot of commercial interest, especially in ensuring that supply routes remain open. At this stage, we are very far away from a hypothetical scenario where China needs to intervene much more strongly. And any sort of intervention will, by default, almost take place through more intense mediation diplomatic efforts. I think we're already seeing some of the fruits of these more intense diplomatic efforts. We see that apparently there's a channel, safe passage for Chinese vessels. I think the point in which China will intervene in a stronger way will be when there is a complete cessation or complete strangulation of any sort of activities in the Strait of Hormuz. And I don't think we are anywhere near it at that point. Even in such a scenario, I think, again, diplomacy will be the first default option, and if need be, foreseeably, an escort party. But I stress again, I don't think we are anywhere near, for now, in triggering that sort of response.
Okay, Deborah, even so, China would be taking care that it is ready to deal with any challenges on that front, and that would include smoothing relations with the United States. Dylan mentioning that it's prioritizing this upcoming trip by President Trump to Beijing. This need for China to reach some kind of compromise agreement, keep ties on even keel with Washington, what's that likely to do to impact any deals or agreements coming out of talks between President Xi and President Trump?
We gotta analyze the tone from Wang Yi when he talks about the U.S. For in this context. It is rather optimistic. Like what Dylan said, Wang Yi did not directly criticize Trump, even when the U.S. Launched strikes on the Middle East. There were no. It was pretty positive. He was talking about maintaining close communication. We do know that from the Chinese side, at least, there is still the desire to keep lines open for the visit to pan out, even though Beijing still has not confirmed that the visit will be taking place. But what we can expect the key change to be would be the agenda. It could now be extended because we do know that China has key energy security interests, especially in the Gulf region, and that global oil prices have surged now due to the supply disruptions, and Asian markets have been hit, going to also face additional shocks. So there is a sense of urgency for China going into this meeting. We know that at the same time, Wang Yi's statement of creating the right conditions also is a reference to in making sure that both sides have mutual respect, that they are agreeing to the discussions in the previous trade talks as well. But it could also be, and I would say, a reference to planning or currently the lack thereof. Analysts going into the meeting have been telling me that the U.S. side is lagging in terms of planning, and that's a departure from the Chinese political practice of heavy planning ahead of a visit such as this, that is quite consequential. We do know that the U.S. and Chinese trade negotiators, they will be meeting very soon in Paris ahead of Trump's visit. It may also give working officials some time to convene, to discuss logistics and to plan things out. And it will be the first time they're meeting ever since the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Trump's global tariffs. So, Dylan, Dr. Loh, with that as a backup, with that as a backdrop of what's been happening, I want to ask right now, the U.S. may be announcing new tariffs quite soon. So how do you think Beijing could calibrate its response to keep the door open for potential Trump visit? And can we expect any tangible outcomes from the Paris talks?
Right. I think Beijing's response so far, and this is set to continue, is one of more calibrated, and I think you gestured at this already, calibrated proportionality. I think there is a bit of also waiting and seeing to see how domestic politics unfold, bearing in mind that with the new 15% global tariffs, there is a deadline to the expiration of the tariffs, and then things could change again. So there is a bit of that response, the sweet spot, Goldilocks zone, so to speak, such that any sort of new measures, the Beijing's response will be calibrated enough not to provoke Trump and America, yet at the same time, it cannot be underwhelming or so underwhelming that Trump sense weakness. So I think it will be proportionate. And the longer game is to eventually reach some sort of agreement or framework of an agreement. I do think that the Besant and Herlivang meeting will be quite important to watch out for. I think that eventually, if that goes well, we could look at something like a deferral or an extension of the truce. I think that before Trump and Xi meet, another meeting to watch out for would be the Japanese PM's meeting with Trump and what sort of message comes out of it, bearing in mind, again, the backdrop of which is this very strident, uncompromising position that Beijing has adopted vis-a-vis Tokyo.
Our final question, Dr. Low, wrapping all this up with what Deborah has mentioned as well, the surprise initially that China did not respond forcefully to what happened in Venezuela and then in Iran, suggestions, where does China see leadership when it talks about offering an alternative model of global leadership? Final question.
Right. So China's playbook in exercising leadership is very different from Washington's leadership. Washington's leadership is built a lot on security guarantees. And in many ways, it is through exclusivity. Whereas for China, it's almost always built through trade, through economics, through diplomacy. And it is open, it is loose, and it is inclusive. I think what the US has done in Venezuela and now in Iran underlines some of these tensions, because on one hand, Chinese leadership as an alternative to play out this moral, normative, rhetorical, diplomatic leadership is not such a bad alternative. On the other hand, I think it also shows us and reveals to the Beijing leadership themselves that there are sometimes limits to exercising leadership without harder security presence. And I think it's something that they got to grapple with. But I would say in the final analysis at this stage, the sort of leadership that China is seeking to provide with its global initiatives, with Community of Shared Future for Mankind, it is going to land on more appealing, attractive years these days.
Thanks, Dr. Dylan Low there, and CNA correspondent Deborah Wong, and of course, Professor Dylan Low from Nanyang Technological University. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Wang Yi also spoke on Taiwan, which he considers an internal affair. Mr. Wang says attempts to create two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan are doomed to fail.
台湾自古以来就是中国的领土，过去、现在和将来都绝无可能成为什么国家。台湾回归中国，这是中国人民抗日战争的胜利成果，也是二战的胜利果实。
And for more on how Taipei has reacted, we're joined by CNA senior correspondent Victoria Jen. We'll start with that question, Victoria. How has Taipei reacted?
Taiwan has, of course, strongly rejected those remarks. Foreign Minister Lin Jialong says Beijing's claim that Taiwan belongs to China is simply not true. He stressed that Taiwan, officially known as the Republic of China, is already a sovereign state, and that the People's Republic of China has never governed the island. Lin also said only Taiwan's 23 million Taiwanese have the right to decide their future. At the same time, Taiwan accused China of being the main source of tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Lin pointed to the increasing number of Chinese military drills and incursions around Taiwan, saying these activities threaten regional stability and international shipping routes. Taipei is urging Beijing to stop what it calls coercion and misinformation, and instead engage in dialogue with Taiwan on the basis of equality and mutual respect. Now, Taiwan is also calling on the international community to continue supporting the island and to push back against any attempts to change the status quo through pressure or the threat of force.
It's a sensitive time for Taiwan, the parliament debating defense spending, and there's a looming deadline for U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. How does all that play into these tensions?
Well, the timing is significant because Taiwan is currently facing a political standoff over defense spending, just as a March 15 deadline approaches for some U.S. arms purchases. Last November, President William Lai proposed a $40 billion special military budget to strengthen Taiwan's defense as pressure from China grows. But that proposal has been blocked in Parliament, which is controlled by the opposition Kuomintang and the Taiwan People's Party. They say the size of the package needs closer review. Now, the debate intensifies after U.S. President Donald Trump announced a record $11 billion arms deals for Taiwan. That has put pressure on the opposition to show it still supports defense cooperation with Washington. Now, the Taiwan People's Party has proposed its own defense package, roughly one-third the size of Lai's plan, saying it would be enough to cover Trump's offer. And at the same time, the KMT has also suggested its own version that would fund the deal and allow room for additional U.S. weapons purchases if needed. But the ruling DPP is insisting on pushing through the full $40 billion package, arguing Taiwan needs a broader military upgrade. And that means the political stalemate is likely to continue. And with the March 15 deadline approaching, pressure is mounting because neither the government nor the opposition wants to appear difficult towards the U.S., which is Taiwan's biggest arms supplier and most important security partner. Wei Su.
Oh, thanks. That's CNA senior correspondent Victoria Jen speaking to us there. And still ahead on this bulletin.
They want to help their family. And helping their family means they have to leave the country.
This report on nurses from a country that has long been one of the world's largest exporters of healthcare staff, as it now grapples with shortages at home.
He walked away from a steady paycheck.
Corporate job is just do for money because you want to get paid.
She runs 6 ice cream shops to fund her university degree. Plus, from a rental flat kitchen to 3 tons of chicken a month. And a BTO on the way. Money Mind, Wednesday on CNA.
Singapore, you've heard of it.
But do you know it? Next on Singapore Hour. Back to school? More like back to cool at Singapore's trendiest hangout.
We wanted this space to represent the new kind of creative cluster that our city hasn't seen to date.
Slow down, breathe in. You've just entered a timeless part of the island state.
Nature and heritage still exist in Seletar. You can't get it anywhere else.
Singapore Hour, Friday on CNA.
7日舞台のことはですね、私が証言するのは最後の人ではないかと。兵器とかまた機械を作るとかいうことだと思っていたのが、ただ結局最近の培養試験的に培養させられとったので。ベスト菌なんて言えばね、なおそろあれが感染したら必ず死んでしまう。ひどいことがあったもんだから。
Inside Unit 731, Monday and Tuesday on CNA.
From busy city hospitals to rural clinics, the same dilemma is unfolding. The demand for care is rising and nurses are carrying most of that load. Tens of millions are already on the job and the number is growing. But whether due to opportunity or cost, global staffing is uneven and the shortage is dire where nurses are needed most.
A global crisis that has been playing out for years. The backbone of healthcare is under growing strain. In 2023, there were nearly 30 million nurses worldwide. By 2030, that figure is projected to rise to 36 million. Now, on paper, that sounds like progress, but look closer. They would need to serve a projected global population of 8.5 billion people. African and Eastern Mediterranean regions are expected to face the most severe shortages in the coming years, despite having some of the greatest healthcare needs. Nurses make up roughly more than 40% of the global health workforce, so any shortage doesn't just affect hospitals, it weakens entire healthcare systems. Today, 1 in 7 nurses works outside their country of origin, a sign of how heavily healthcare depends on migrant labor. But the issue isn't just numbers, it's distribution. Many nurses are trained and ready to serve, yet they're not always deployed where demand is greatest. Nearly 78% of the world's nurses are concentrated in countries that account for less than half of the global population. That's even as countries such as India and the Philippines continue to produce nurses at scale. 10 years ago, almost 200 countries pledged to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. A third of those goals are directly tied to health, including workforce expansion and financing. But global progress is slowing. India alone trains around 300,000 nurses every year. It's one of the few countries with enough supply to meet both domestic and overseas demand. But that balance is rare. Across much of Asia, the outflow of nurses to wealthier economies is straining local healthcare systems. The Philippines, long one of the world's largest exporters of nurses, is now grappling with shortages at home. And it is not slowing the pipeline. Instead, it plans to expand training capacity and produce even more nurses. Many countries are eager to recruit them. Singapore, for example, relies on thousands of Filipino nurses to bolster its healthcare system. In the Philippines, the promise of opportunity abroad now collides with a growing crisis of care at home. And that's where we turn next, to the Philippines numbers and what they reveal about the future of global nursing.
Nurse Ralph Jason Ching has been working in the same hospital for 18 years now, but he hopes to leave the Philippines soon in search of a healthier work-life balance.
Ang bilis po ng hiring nila. No? I was fortunate enough na nagkaroon po ng isang employer. They finance everything po, from the review to the mga registrations and everything. Kasama na po yung processing ng visa.
Ralph Ryan Garcia is a newly minted nurse, having passed the Philippine licensure exam last year. But he's not planning to make a career out of it at home.
The quality of life that I could have abroad is going to be better than staying here in the Philippines.
Times have changed, and when I interview students, what is your primary motivation? Why do you want to take up nursing? They usually say they want to help their family. And helping their family means they have to leave the country. So I cannot do anything about it because that's the reality. That's the sad reality.
The Philippines and its healthcare conundrum. Nurses are taught and trained that the job is a calling. But to an ever-increasing number of new and veteran nurses, it's a ticket out.
Our nurses are globally accepted. And it seems that most countries that are developing health systems try to hire Filipino nurses, which is like I now consider it not a problem, but our soft power.
In the developed world, coming under the care of a Filipino nurse is almost universal. For the Philippines, it's a source of national profit over healthcare pain. Some 300 to 350,000 Filipino nurses are spread out across the world, while their country is lacking around 160,000, according to the Department of Health. Filipino nurses are a labor product made for export. However, while the Philippines also churns out sailors, industrial and domestic workers by the tens of thousands, their migration does not carry the same public health consequences.
So sabi nga namin pag nagbibituan kami, one nurse is to one ward. So 100 patients, minsan dalawa lang po yung nurses. So syempre, nagkakaroon din po ng burnout sa mga nurses natin.
In some hospitals, one nurse would be dealing with 25 patients, 50 patients. But in fact, it's recommended dapat one nurse to 3 patients lang.
The government does not intend to curb nursing exports to address the domestic shortage, but it continues to work on incentives to encourage these healthcare workers to stay home.
We're trying to be competitive with our salaries. We've started to increase the government salaries for nurses, which is much higher than that of the private sector. So then we're increasing the other benefit packages for nurses, like housing, car loans, and other benefit packages, health insurance, so that they will be discouraged to leave the country and stay with their families here.
The government is offering more, but for many nurses, not soon enough. For Ralph Jason Ching, it's not about wanting to leave. It's about not having enough reasons to stay.
For more on the series, head to our digital platforms or CNA.Asia or download the CNA mobile app. And that's this Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. Plus, we're on Facebook and YouTube.